So you talk a lot about shifting HR as a cost center to a profit center. What are some big levers in that?
Well, I think the biggest is just a mindset lever, which is I think a lot of people, for whatever reason, when they go into HR, they think that they go there because they're a people person or like they like to plan parties or something like that. And realistically, human capital is the biggest lever that organizations have to pull right now because we all have pretty much equivalent access to capital. We all have pretty much equivalent access to technology for the most part. And so what's the only lever you have to pull? It's humanity, right? And so organizations at least take the mindset that their human capital can produce value and see, outsized returns in the process, really have an advantage because most companies, for whatever reason, just haven't gotten with the program.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ignite podcast. I'm your host, Brian Bell. Today, we're thrilled to have Cole Napper on the program. He's a globally recognized expert in people analytics, workforce planning, talent intelligence, lots of different things. He's VP of Research, Innovation, and Talent Insights at Lightcast, also lots of things. And he's been shaping the future of his data-driven HR department there. He's also co-host of the #1 people analytics podcast and Substack newsletter, Directionally Correct. What a cool name, where he breaks down the biggest trends in the space. He's led transformational HR and analytics efforts at companies like FedEx, Texas Instruments, Toyota, Pepsi. I've heard of them. They make sugar water, I think, Motive. And he's a key thought leader in the future of work, AI, HR, and talent intelligence. Thanks for coming on, Cole.
Yeah. They also make salty chips as well. It's like,
Why don't we start at the beginning? Like, how did you get into this intersection of HR analytics and business strategy?
yeah. So I have a background. So I have a PhD in industrial organizational psychology. So it's about kind of like the psychology of the workplace.
Yeah.
And upon graduating, I immediately went into doing workforce planning, right, which is very much adjacent to people analytics. But the term people analytics didn't exist back then. But one of the things that I figured out really quickly is if you're trying to do really good business led workforce planning, you can't do so without the corresponding analytics. And as I started really going that direction in my career, the term HR analytics became a thing, which turned into workforce analytics, which turned into people analytics. And ever since then, I've just kind of ridden that wave as it's crashed through the workforce.
Yeah, and then people analytics wasn't really a term until probably 15 years ago.
Yeah. Or really broad adoption, maybe 2015.
Yeah, that's about the time we talked about this right before we recorded that I was looking into a people analytics startup. I was, with one of my devs I really like, dev managers I really like to work with, and we are looking at the space, and we just felt like it was like a little too early. There's kind of like incumbents, like Microsoft attacking the space, and it was going to be the more HR people we talked to. Now that I'm thinking about it, the more they were like, yeah, it's going to be just a really complex, nasty startup to work on. But I think some have been pretty successful in it.
Well, you always have to ask yourself, are you like 10 years too late or 10 years too early? And I feel like we've had that question a lot in people analytics ever since its inception.
Yeah, I like to say that you can't be too late to a market, but you can definitely be too early, right? I think now would be a much better time to build a people analytics startup than 2015.
Well, and I think the market bears that because we've seen an explosion since 2022 of people analytics startups. So
How would you define people analytics? Because it means different things to different people.
Yeah, I take a really because I find like especially on my podcast, these debates get really to be really pedantic. And so I just take a really expansive definition and I say it's like analytics on people at work, generally employees. And so anything about people at work, but we've in our podcast, we've interviewed people like in the NFL, and so that is technically people analytics. We've interviewed folks who were in higher education, who are training workers. So that's technically people analytics. So I take a really expansive definition just because I find it to be more interesting the more you can include. But some people, if they really narrowly define it, they're talking about, what's headcount, what's turnover, what's attrition, what's, demographics of the workforce and that type of thing.
Yeah, it's really any way that you would measure your employees. I guess if you have basketball players and you're measuring them on, their how many rebounds they get and what's their plus minus and all these other stats.
My wish list is to interview the guy who does people analytics for the NBA. So that's going to be a fun one.
Yeah, I'm a big NBA nerd, so I can see myself going down that rabbit hole at some point. I think that'd be an awesome podcast. I'd listen to that.
Yeah, for sure.
So you've worked at huge organizations and also some startups. What are some key differences in kind of HR tech adoption between large enterprises and startups?
Yeah, I think it's like the whole, like the mid-sized to small enterprise market vertical versus the enterprise vertical. In the enterprise vertical, you get all the legacy players. And so it starts with the big three, the Workdays, the Oracles, the SAPs. In the smaller space, you get a lot more innovation. And frankly, I would say from my experience is a lot more fun because you having been in that space, like you even get these companies that are kind of like co-investing with you because you're tackling a new problem that you've never tackled before at your organization, but they're also building a company for the first time. And so you can kind of co-evolve together, and that's a lot of fun.
Yeah. How should founders, a big portion of our podcast audience are founders, right? How should founders, particularly, kind of the early stage companies, maybe all the way to like a mid stage, think about people analytics?
You're taking kind of the traditional like HR playbook to people analytics. Really, you don't need to think about it that much until you have over like 100, 150 employees. Because if you can get everybody around, like, Jeff Bezos always talked about the two pizza rule, right? You can feed everybody with two pizzas. You don't really need a lot of people analytics, generally speaking. Now, that said, if you're getting into more of kind of the progressive areas, like trying to understand, human being variability and performance in the workplace, well, one human can have a lot of variability, right? But that's getting into the really sophisticated side of things. And so I would say, generally speaking, it's only until you grow to a certain level that you can't really manage people by line of sight. That's really when people analytics comes into play.
Yeah, and I love that example. As someone who worked at AWS, they very much live and breathe that two pizza team motto, roughly 5 to 10 people, and pretty autonomous, right? Cross functional, pretty autonomous, and you execute pretty quickly. And I like this 150 number. That's the Dunbar number.
Yep.
For,
Dunbar's number.
for those that don't know what that is, maybe you could explain. I'm sure you know it.
Yeah, I mean, I only know like the Malcolm Gladwell version of it, but it's essentially like human beings from our hunter gatherer past were like wired or genetically to be predisposed to know about 150 people. I think that's a pretty cogent explanation.
Bodes terribly for our portfolio because I have 170 startups now and counting, and we're doing another 100 per year
Yeah,
across
you
our
better
active.
get rid of 20 of them.
Oh man. Well, at least half of them will go to zero at some point. But yeah, anyway, uh, just statistically. So you talk a lot about shifting HR as a cost center to a profit center. What are some big levers in that?
Well, I think the biggest is just a mindset lever, which is I think a lot of people, for whatever reason, when they go into HR, they think that they go there because they're a people person or like they like to plan parties or something like that. And realistically, human capital is the biggest lever that organizations have to pull right now because we all have pretty much equivalent access to capital. We all have pretty much equivalent access to technology for the most part. And so what's the only lever you have to pull? It's humanity. Right. And so organizations at least take the mindset that their human capital can produce value and see, outsized returns in the process, really have an advantage because most companies, for whatever reason, just haven't gotten with the program. And so my whole goal is to bring about a tangible ROI. So have it actually make in your OKRs or your KPIs, make a tangible dollar figure commitment to your business on an annual basis and then deliver upon that. And typically my rule of thumb is it needs to be X the cost of your team all in. So the cost of salaries and fringe plus technology and resources. If you can text the ROI of your cost, you're doing a really great job of transforming, from a cost center to a profit center.
I love that. Speaking of equal access to technology, what are some ways that you're thinking about integrating AI or you're seeing AI kind of integrated into some of these HR workflows?
Yeah, for the traditional HR worker, like I'll talk about like the median employee in HR, they're probably not going to utilize, the latest update from OpenAI or Anthropic or, they don't know what DeepSeek is. They've never heard of it. And so realistically, the best that they're going to do is use the AI that's embedded into the SaaS tools that they're already utilizing in their day job. And so they're really beholden to the workflow that maybe a Workday provides or a ServiceNow or, whether it be a recruiting chatbot or Paradox has done a lot in the space to really use AI to improve the throughput of hiring processes. All those are the areas where I think the median HR person is going to come into play. The real sweet spot though that I think is coming and is not here, and I don't know why it's not here because it's very doable, is a lot of HR is knowledge management. And I think AI is really going to be able to come in. And I know there's a lot of startups that have gone in this space.
Yeah, I've seen some knowledge management startups. Yeah.
yeah, for whatever reason, it just hasn't taken off like I thought it would. And it's just, can we take all the documents, all the policies, all the information, and just turn that into, whether it's a rag-based model, what have you, and create an environment where any employee can go in at any time and ask a question about how they interface with their employer, and they get the right answer every time. Like that to me would be, and that takes off the workload of some HR people half to 70% of their time. And in that case, you can either, they can be 70% more productive, or you need 70% less people doing those jobs, depending on what strategy you want to take as an organization.
Yeah, we have one called MebeBot in the
Hmm.
portfolio. I don't
I
know if
know
you've
that
run
team.
across
Yeah.
Beth. She's been on the podcast as well.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, and she that's basically what it is. It's meant to be kind of that knowledge base for HR for employees and help them onboard and stuff. I've seen some other ones where they're kind of crawling all of the UI and creating documentation, but that's more customer facing. And then I've seen other ones where they're crawling all the internal docs and putting it all into the context window, more or less, of a
Yeah,
of a large language model.
exactly.
It's another startup I was actually working on with a friend after the people analytics one was but the technology was too early. And this is like 2016, 17. And it was like the dream of mine at that point as a product manager was like to not have to answer all these stupid questions, not stupid questions, but like lots of dozens of questions that would come in throughout the day from various constituents around the company.
Well, it's not just questions, it's also troubleshooting. Like I fat fingered my zip code when I put it into my employee benefits, and now the mail's not showing up to my house. Can you update my employee zip code? But that field is locked in our HCM for whatever reason. It requires an administrative access. It's like stuff like that that I really think AI is going to be able to come in and be a super helpful thing.
You're seeing AI kind of infiltrate lots of different functional areas, sales, marketing, development, and now HR. Do you foresee the HR department shrinking in the future along with these other departments? Or do you feel like because HR has just done more efficiently, there's more HR demanded, kind of like a Jevons paradox of HR?
Yeah, I think what you're going to see is you're going to see everything in between, right? What I mean by that is, I brought it up earlier. It's like, are you going to be 70% more productive, or are you going to need 70% less people? I think every discipline, HR included, is going to go through that equation. And because, the economy is so vast, you're going to have every experiment run. You're going to have we're going to make every employee 10 times more productive. And so we're just going to keep the number of employees we have, and we'll 10x as an organization, or we're just going to do it with 1 in 10 people and everything in between. And I think it's going to be kind of an emergent experiment in the workplace to see what strategies are most successful.
Yeah, makes sense. So lots of organizations out there struggle with turning this data into actionable insights. What's the biggest mistake that you see companies making in this area?
I think the biggest mistake is actually not focusing on producing tangible value. I think a lot of times we get caught up in, and a good friend of mine, Alexis Fink, who's the head of people analytics and workforce planning at Meta, she talks about she's anti-interesting. And what does that mean? Is the worst thing that can happen in people analytics is you present your findings and the leaders say, "Oh, that's so interesting." And the reality is, because that means that they're not going to do anything with it, is that analytics and insights must influence decision making, and those decisions must be enacted in the real world to make a tangible impact. And so I am only focused on decision making and then execution.
What are some like kind of deliverables or outcomes of value that you see typically, in people analytics?
Well, I'll take like an example at FedEx, my most recent employer before Lightcast. They're operating in every market, in every city, in almost every country,
Yeah,
and
like
even
hundreds of
countries
thousands
that
of
aren't
employees.
countries,
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
right. And so you're looking at this, and you're making real-time labor decisions everywhere all at once for hundreds of thousands of employees. And so if you can make a 1% improvement in retention across the board, that can affect hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of capital at the organization. And so we're trying to make those kinds of influences on a case by case basis to be able to do that. And so,
Kind of involves not just analytics, but predictive models around retention, where you're kind of
correct.
saying, hey, if these are the weights and biases that go into this predictive model, and if we could just turn these like little levers of
Mhm.
satisfaction, employee benefits and satisfaction, we can increase retention, which saves us like tens of millions of dollars or even billions of dollars.
Well, and sometimes the economy, like right now, it does the work for you. So you'll get percentage point bumps in retention just because people can't find other jobs. And that's why it's really important to not only have internal people analytics, but to combine that with external labor market information that's sometimes called talent intelligence. That's why I really like workforce planning, people analytics, and talent intelligence because you can get the entire environmental scan. And if you can bring those data into your models, you can have those insights before it even impacts your organization.
Yeah, one that I think of a lot is Glint that got acquired by Microsoft,
Mhm.
right? Where it's kind of like constantly pulsing these surveys out, right? Just kind of keeping tabs on like how are people feeling and do you feel heard at work and do you have a friend at work and like all these questions.
When even I don't know if it was Glint, but some of these companies have created like a sentiment index of all of the like publicly traded organizations. So they're trying to say, hey, we have real time sensing on employee engagement and like concepts. And how is that going to impact the potential bottom line in the next day, month, 3 months, 6 months for those organizations if they see a dip in sentiment?
Yeah, it's a really exciting area. How do you think about the kind of the other side of this argument, kind of the big brother aspect of this? There was a famous example recently of a YC company that was
Mhm.
watching factory workers with a camera as they're in
Yeah.
this batch actually. And, you know, YC had to quickly remove the post because basically they're just using cameras to do people analytics on people in factories and making sure that they're working the assembly line. You also have like mouse trackers and all these tracking systems that can occur. It always I'm sure Microsoft was watching me at work,
Yeah.
and it always felt like, Big Brother's there.
I think this actually goes back a lot to my training in psychology, where it talks about like institutional review boards. Are they given informed consent before something happens? Do they have the ability to opt in or opt out? Or is it related to a company policy? So I'll give an example. Like one of the companies I worked for was a startup called Motive, and they use video cameras, much like the YC company. But the question is like whether it's ethical is to what end is the monitoring being done? So they have inward facing cameras for truckers in their vehicles. And one of the things that the camera is monitoring is the person wearing their seatbelt? Are they swerving? Are they drinking and driving? Right. And they have cameras on the exterior of the vehicle. Again, this is why I take an expansive definition of people analytics because I actually considered that a people analytics use case, even though the company didn't market it in that way. Right. And it's to say, to what end? Well, it's for driver safety and for public safety. Right. Now, you could say that's a surveillance state, but it also reduced the insurance policies for people who utilize the software because they knew that they were less likely to get in wrecks. And if they were going to get in wreck, they were wearing their seatbelt. And so, they were less likely to have a severe injury as a consequence of an accident. And so that's going to reduce the insurance. And so, companies who invested in that software believed in that type of thing. Now, if you're just doing, to use the example that you used earlier about mouse tracking software and even companies who are utilizing software that uses the camera on your laptop to monitor like you while you're working. Do people know that? Do they have informed consent? Were they able to opt in or opt out? Is this related to a company policy? And to what end is it being used? And I think in all four of those cases, they fail. Right. And so that's where, sometimes you might get 2 out of 4, but if you're failing all four, you probably shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, I like that framework. What do you think about all the, Doge stuff happening in the government right now? Email me 5 things that you accomplished this week, or you're fired kind of stuff that's happening in the government. Like how much, like I think it's 25% of our budget. I'm guessing the government must have a people analytics system.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't.
No, you think about what is OPM, the Office of Personnel Management. I mean, these are hundreds, if not thousands, of people. That's like the people analytics arm of the federal government. They do workforce planning at scale. It's a really low tech way to figure out somebody is working or not. If you ask them to send an email back, I mean, I don't know. I could probably come up with a few more ways that would be more helpful in figuring out if your workers are
Yeah. I mean, I used to write this every Friday afternoon before I'd left for the weekend. I'd write my boss like a kind of a week long summary of what I did.
yeah.
And my bosses loved it. They loved it. They're like,
Everybody
"You're the only person that sends this to me," and it got me promoted and got me ahead.
Sure. It's a
Great.
great way to get ahead in the world. Like, one of the things I used to do is I used to have a quarterly check, and this was when I was in the startup world with my CEO, and I had all of my KPIs. He didn't ask me to do this. I had all my KPIs, all the customers I had met with, everything in front of them, all the data put together. He's like, "Wow, this is great." It's like, "Yeah." And I was like, "Why don't other people do this?" I'm like, "I don't know. They could, you know."
Yeah.
So
Maybe they're slacking off.
yeah, maybe. Yeah,
Yeah, email me 5 things you accomplished this week. He probably has something there. I wonder how many people got fired after not replying to that.
I have no idea.
That'd be really interesting to find out. So there's been a rise in these kind of talent intelligence platforms. What's your take on their role in workforce planning?
Well, I will say, so I work for Lightcast. They're the OG player in talent intelligence. So MZ and Burning Glass, which merged in 2022 to become Lightcast, both had over 20 years of experience in this space. And frankly, we say we define the category. So I actually believe a lot of the talent intelligence companies aren't even doing talent intelligence, frankly. But the way I define talent intelligence is taking that external lens to internal problems, right? And so we take a lot of data from the labor market, understanding the trends that are going on out in the workplace, but even combining it to focus on new problems that organizations are having, thinking about things like trying to create skills based organizations. That's a really hot topic right now. We have data on I think it's 151 countries on the skills of their workers. And then you combine that with employee profiles at particular organizations. You can do a lot of really cool stuff. And their role in workforce planning, I don't think you can do good workforce planning if you don't have good talent intelligence. Because if you're workforce planning and you're just looking at, workforce planning in its simplest terms is supply and demand, right? Well, if you only have internal data, you only got the supply side of the equation. Really, you need to understand the external labor market to know the demand that you have in terms of your job postings, but the availability of talent to fill those job postings. And so I don't think you can do good workforce planning if you don't have good talent intelligence, frankly.
Makes sense. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about AI again, given it's penetrating all the departments like we talked about, but how is it impacting this area specifically that we're talking about workforce planning?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if there has been a good workforce planning AI vendor out there yet. Maybe that's coming. Maybe I'm just not aware of them. But I imagine a day, and I don't think this is too far in the future, is organizations, they're already taking data like Lightcast and ingesting it via data shares into their own workforce planning methodologies. And so you take all of your internal data, you combine it with all the external data. And then if you can purchase or build your own AI layer on top of that, you could build pretty sophisticated workforce planning methodologies. The problem is they're not scalable because they would be bespoke to your own organization. And so I think there's opportunities in the workforce planning market for vendors to do this at scale. I just haven't seen it yet.
And what about on skill-based hiring? What do you kind of see evolving in the next 5 years?
Yeah, skill. I think it's one of those interesting cases where I think the technology is following the trend rather than the technology enabling the trend. I think, probably about 6 or 7 years ago, organizations, for a variety of reasons, decided, you know what, maybe the college degree isn't what it once used to be. And so we should start finding a new way of hiring for folks. And they
Yeah,
at
especially
the
if
time,
you can go through a boot camp in 90 days coming out of high school and be ready to like be a front end coder. Like,
exactly.
why go get a 4-year degree at all? It's just you're going to learn the same stuff you learned in high school at a little higher level.
Mhm.
Great. And then you're going to come out 4 years later with a bunch of debt, or your parents are going to spend a bunch of money to put you through that experience.
Yeah.
And maybe it's time to return. A big problem about this, they talked about this on the Allen podcast, which I thought was really insightful, which was, the big problem is the government stepping in and enabling people to take out massive loans, which has created a huge demand for college, which is there's a fixed set of college, there's a fixed supply of college. So, and you got all these dollars chasing it, especially the elite ones, the top, call it 50 or 100 institutions.
Yeah.
And so consequently, the cost of college has gone way up because there's just a certain supply, increasing demand with increasing dollars. And maybe we need to get out of that and just say, maybe a college degree isn't the path to the middle class or the, upper middle class anymore. Maybe it is like developing skills that are actually needed on the job market today.
Yeah, you went there, so it's funny because I was on a podcast a few weeks ago, and the host accused me of I was killing the American dream by talking about how the college degree might not be necessary anymore for furthering yourself in the world. And I was like, I don't think that's what I'm saying. I think what I'm saying is you can live the American dream, but you can do it via skills, and the college degree as a credential may no longer be required, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'd be way more impressed. I would be much more likely to hire like an associate at Team Ignite that founded a startup at 18, raised money and exited it. And now is like looking to break into venture capital and they're 21 years old and didn't go to college. Like
Talk
I
about skill
100% hire that
acquisition.
person.
Yeah, they're going to be excellent. And the thing about it is, so organizations discovered that skill based hiring and creating a skill based organization was actually kind of a leading trend of where the world was going. And technology vendors realize that we don't necessarily have ways of classifying skills at scale. And so, the internal view of this, through the kind of the legacy providers is we'll just get everybody internally to fill out their employee profile, and that'll be an accurate assessment of their skills, and oh, how wrong they were, right? And so the best thing that you can do is try to, and some of these companies are trying to do things like skill inference, but really is trying to tie the skills to the roles that people have and understand if you're in this role, here are the skills that you likely have. And then can you incorporate that into your hiring, into your learning, into your promotions, into your job architecture, into your wages? And there's lots of vendors out there that do this, but the Lightcast is one that is able to help organizations do this effectively.
What do you think about the kind of the rise of remote work and fractional work and gig work?
Mhm.
It seems that, especially post COVID, my partner included, left her high paying, managing a big team corporate job and doesn't want to go back full time. She'd much rather work 10, 20 hours a week and have a better lifestyle. Do you think that's a good trend, or does that kind of inhibit our ability to be innovative and kind of push the ball forward as a country? Should employers kind of support this kind of fractional work and remote work
Yeah.
and gig work? And how do you think about all that?
I think they already are. I think this is the wing of what used to be called borrow from the build buy borrow bot version of workforce planning. Borrow used to mean hiring consultants, right? But now it can mean gig work, it can mean fractional work, it can mean all of those things.
Yeah, so you pay somebody for some output.
Correct.
We're going to
Correct.
pay you 100,000 instead of hiring somebody to constantly do this. I'll just pay you the 100 grand and get the output that I need.
And I think again, you're seeing a lot more of this in the startup space and the tech space and kind of the organizations that are implementing kind of more flexible operating models for how they work. And I don't mean flexibility like remote versus hybrid versus in person. I mean, just they want to have a dynamic way and a nimble way of operating. And you can scale up and you can scale down really quickly if you take more of that fractional or gig based work. I was actually talking to the one of the people that works at research at Upwork earlier this week, and it was funny to me because they're all into this. Like this is like what they do.
I
They're
employ
seeing
people on Upwork for Team Ignite. Love the platform.
well, and the thing that they're running into is AI is disrupting a lot of their gig workers right now. And so the
We're
question
making
I
them more
have,
efficient. Yeah.
I think that many organizations love the fact that they can use fractional workers and gig workers, and you've seen a huge uptick in this in the last few years. And I'm worried, will it last? Right. And so, is AI going to be the new gig worker? Is really the question I have at the moment.
Yes. Or like the way I'm looking at it is, I have three different contractors working on three different aspects of this podcast, right? The editor, the clip person, the social media manager, right? And all of them use AI.
Yep.
So it's making them more efficient. So they're probably 2x more efficient than they were without the AI. And so I get twice as much output per hour of gig worker.
Yeah. And so from my podcast and my streaming platform, it AI already automatically produces clips. So I don't need a clip person. I don't do clips personally,
Yeah.
but like if I needed that, I would never had to purchase that service now.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of you, like Riverside makes clips. When I upload this Substack, they'll make clips. But I use
Yep.
Opus. I
Substack
like
does
Opus
it
the best. It kind of just tends to work the best.
too. Yeah.
But still, it kind of needs a human in the loop. Most AI does. Most AI really needs a human in the loop to just kind of supervise it and just make sure it's doing the right thing.
But I think this goes back to the question before, which is, if people are X more productive, do you have the same number and they're 10 times more productive, or do you have 1/10 of them? If it takes, what used to take a person doing clips, 10 hour, I'm not saying it actually takes 10 hours, but let's say it's 10 hours a
Yeah,
month.
they have to watch the whole episode, find all the
Yeah.
clips, clip them, put the captions over that. I mean, just producing a clip probably took an hour of somebody's time.
Yeah. And so now, and then they were doing it 10 episodes a month. Now maybe it takes them 30 minutes. Right. And so then the trade
For
off
the
is,
whole episode.
yeah. Does the person do, if it was taking 10 hours and now it takes 30 minutes, do they do, 20 of them for 20 different podcasts a month? Or does Brian Bell decide, you know what, I could probably just do this myself? Right. And I think that's the judgment call that organizations are making with the gig work is like, I could use the gig worker, but it's so small. Maybe I'll just do it myself.
Yeah, I've kind of gone with the former. It saves me an hour or two of my time every week to just hire somebody to supervise the AI. I did it myself initially with Opus, but I think the answer is somewhere in between. Like I think and I see this in my startups, right? Like the capital efficiency is going through the roof right now of just how much ARR you can get per dollar of money spent. It used to be really good to do 1-to-1, right? I went and raised $1 million, I burnt $1 million, got $1 million of ARR additive in the business. That was pretty impressive. And now I'm seeing, you know, I raised 500 and got to 2 million. That's really, now we're talking about 4-to-1.
Yeah.
You're getting $4 of ARR for every dollar you burn. And that's really, really impressive. So I think we're just going to see an explosion of productivity across startups. And now the question is, does that translate into a lot of these like 4-day-a-week jobs where people take every Friday off?
Yeah.
Or does it translate into, I can get everything done in 6 hours, so we have a 6-hour workday. It's 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon, and everybody go home. You can work longer if you want, but that's what's expected with a whole lunch hour. Do you feel like that the promise of Keynesian, like I think he famously said 100 years ago, like eventually we'll have a, whatever it was, 20-hour work week.
I can't remember.
Do you think that happens, or we just kind of keep people butts in seats 8 hours a day, 5 days a week?
I don't think it's necessarily butts and seats. I think a lot of people kind of strawmanned it to be that. I think my assessment's a little bit more like it's just a slow creeping thing that people get on the hedonic treadmill of productivity gains, and so they're 15 minutes more productive this week than last week, and they're like, well, I guess I just got to fill up that 15 minutes elsewhere. I don't think anybody's necessarily telling them they have to do that. But what ends up happening, and then there's like employment policies, even at the government level. Like I believe it's either 32 or 35 hours a week that you have to be considered a full-time employee to receive full-time benefits in many states. And so there's actually an incentive for employees to work beyond that period of time so that they can receive those benefits because again, the United States isn't a country that has like universal health care or something like that. So you'd have to do like a lockstep change of the entire employment contract, the social contract, even between employers and employees and governments. If you really wanted to change this, I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying that we don't have a great history of making that type of transformative change in the United States.
I've kind of lost touch with what it's like to go into the office because I just work from this little home office in my pajamas over the last over 2 years now. So I've lost touch. I wonder, what does it feel like in the office these days? Does it feel like people are just more efficient and working a little less hours per day per week? Like, what's the data say? Like, how are people, like, you're the people analytics guy. What
Yeah.
does the data show us on this?
Well, it's different company by company because there's been this whole return to office debate, and there's been every experiment under the sun of is it 3 days a week? Is it 2 days a week? Is it 0 days a week? Is it, I
It's up
think,
to you and your manager.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And the reality is, like, I'll say it from a personal standpoint, first of all, when I would go into the office at my last company, I had Zoom calls all day. And so
Yeah.
I would go into my office and I would get on Zoom and I would have
Right.
8 hours of Zoom calls. And it was atrocious. Right.
Crazy.
And it's
So
because
I spent an hour or 2 hours of my time or more driving to an office just so I could sit in some conference room or at my desk on Zoom calls.
exactly. And
And
it's
that's how
because
all meetings are done now,
yeah. And I think the balance, and I think
or
this
Teams or
this is
whatever.
being
Yeah.
panned out in the data, is that the balance is if you have a geographically dispersed team, you can be more productive most of the time if you're remote. However, real high fidelity, in-depth collaboration happens in person. And so if you're a
You're
team
building
that's
something super innovative. If you're launching rockets to space, like at SpaceX, you can't do that remote. I mean, maybe like there's some single digit percentage of people at SpaceX that can work remote because it's whatever their job role, lends itself to that. But yeah, if you're doing highly innovative product design, engineering kind of work,
well, and you think about like why do so many companies have offsites? Presumably those offsites aren't just so that the company can get together and have a fancy dinner and drink cocktails, right? It's because they know that certain things, certain levels of rapport are only built in person, right? And so I think if teams have this dispersed environment, then that creates kind of one environment. But we've seen a huge push for companies saying, no, we need everybody in the same city, in the same place at the same time. And that may feel backwards, but presumably they have the reasons for doing so.
yeah, I think for Team Ignite, we'll never have an office. I mean, maybe I'll have a small office in San Francisco someday, but we'll always be remote first because that's just how we kind of grew up and we invest worldwide, right? So we'll have people all over the world talking to startups and yeah, it just won't make sense that, you got to come into Sand Hill Road and come into the office.
Lightcast, we have an office in Moscow, Idaho, and then everybody else is geographically dispersed. And so I'm one of those employees, and we meet up at conferences and things all the time. But generally speaking, most people are not in the office in Moscow.
Shout out to Team Out, our portfolio company that helps organize offsites. So look them up. They're pretty awesome.
Fantastic.
Yeah, yeah. So what are some of the biggest challenges that companies will face in this kind of new world future of work that we're kind of entering or slowly creeping towards?
Well, I actually want to come back to something because I think it's related to this question that you were saying earlier about, how companies are getting to higher multiples of ARR sooner with requiring less resources. Presuming that they're able to sell into, established enterprises, right? Whether they're mid-size or large companies. And the thing that I foresee is there's just like as time goes along, I think the natural size of organizations is going to shrink.
Right. And you saw this with banks over the last 40 years. I probably said this a dozen times on this podcast.
Mhm.
The average bank back in the 70s took had for a given amount of AUM at the bank that's under management, they would have about 1,000 employees, the average size bank. And now that same AUM only takes like 7 people as a software and automation and to a lesser extent AI.
And so I wonder is with these AI gains, is this a temporary phenomena or a permanent phenomena of seeing this? Because if companies shrink in their size, they actually probably need less software. They need less services,
Mm.
right? Because they're smaller. And so is the market actually going to shrink, even though there'll be more presumably more employers out there, will there actually be less pie to draw from?
I think
Will you see that? And I guess I'd just be curious what your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that question. And what I think will happen is we'll see 1,000 flowers of startups blooming in every nook and cranny. And
Yeah.
so the size of organizations will shrink. We'll have this barbell structure in the market. There'll still be huge, massive enterprises like the Microsofts, the Mag 7, these big companies, conglomerates. And then you'll have a smaller number than you have currently of these like mid-stage companies,
Mhm.
a mid-size. And then you'll have a plethora of sub 100 employee startups and small companies and lifestyle businesses and small businesses.
Yeah.
And the rise of I think New York Times just covered this or Forbes, the rise of the solo entrepreneur. That percentage of startups run by a solo founder has doubled in the last, 5 or 10 years. And because of AI enables people just to be more effective and efficient. So if you are pretty good at coding and you're pretty good at selling, you can basically bootstrap this startup to get it pretty far. Yeah, that's a really interesting world we're entering. It's a really great time to be an early stage investor because of that,
Yeah.
because these startups are more capital efficient and there's more being created. So the wins will get bigger, and there's just more opportunity.
Yeah, I feel like I'd be curious if you agree with this. I think going from 0 to like 5 million ARR is going to be so much easier, but I think going from like 5 million to 100 million is actually going to be much more rare. Is kind of the
Yeah.
way I look at it.
Yeah, I see a lot of startups kind of fizzle out at 1 or 2 million of ARR, and they turn into like little lifestyle businesses. So I tell them it's a big challenge for us, right? Because we're trying to look for those billion-dollar companies, right? And there's just a certain amount of revenue, typically 100 billion, that you have to get to be a billion-dollar company. As an investor, it's a challenge because there's lots of really good opportunities of just lifestyle businesses, right? They should probably never raise venture capital. And so you're trying to tease out the difference between $1 billion unicorn opportunity and just a really cool little small software company lifestyle business.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah, it's a challenge. Yeah. How do you see the challenges of these companies and over the next 5 or 10 years and adapting kind of this changing landscape?
Well, the way that I look at it is, I think people analytics is going to have to get reinvented in that world, right? Because I go again going back to my IO psychology roots. It's really the psychology of the workplace. The workplace is still going to be there. It's just going to look completely different than around the industrial revolution, right? It's not people sitting on an assembly line all going in their cars and doing things the same way. We've already figured out what people analytics like in a knowledge-based economy, but what does it look like in a AI-based economy where everybody, has their kind of novelty side projects, everybody's fractional, everybody is a solo entrepreneur or what have you. It's hard to understand what it's going to look like in that environment. I will say though, on the Lightcast side of things, we're going to be selling data into those organizations who are going to enable them to build those AI applications, right? And so I think on the talent intelligence side, it's like it's a gold mine right now. And I think it's just exciting times. But I think people analytics is going to be in for a reckoning here in the next few years.
Yeah, and that was kind of leads into my next question. Your podcast, Directionally Correct, has gained a massive following.
Mhm.
Why do you think people analytics is having a moment right now, and what is this reckoning coming?
Well, I think it's actually not having a moment any longer. I think it peaked in popularity in 2022, and I've got the data to back that up.
Wow.
And not to say like I think the interest in the space is high. I think organizational investment peaked in 2022. Now, I actually did some research into this to show that there was a really like zero point 0.9 correlation between interest rates and the M2 monetary policy and people analytics investments, which tells me that people analytics was seen as a speculative investment. And so it's going to be at the whims of organizations. And so why do I
In other words, it has high beta, right? When the market's doing well and rates are low, people invest in these kind of more fringy people analytics software packages and things like that. And when rates get high, got cost of money's up, they're like, we're going to pull back on that.
Yep. And so I have a book that I'm publishing that's coming out in July, and it's called People Analytics and Generative AI: How to Make It a Business Asset. And so I think the challenge of the field is to reinvent itself to not just be a speculative asset, but to be an asset that has returns for organizations. And I put together a playbook for how organizations can do that. And so I really see that's the future. How do we get back?
Well, we'll have to have you back on the podcast when the book comes out.
Yeah, that would be
Yeah, I'd
great.
love to read that. And yeah, that's amazing. It's something I've been on the back burner for me. I wrote like half of a book on angel investing in AI companies, and I kind of just like lost interest. I'm like 3 or 4 chapters away from finishing it, and I just never finished it. I just got so busy.
Yeah, it's writing a book is no fun.
Yeah, it's so much work. And then you have to rework it a lot.
Yes.
So it's not just like, so you get the book and then you're like, you got to go back and reread it multiple times. And you think about how much time it takes to read a book. I mean, 10 hours, call it.
Yeah.
And then you have to do that multiple times. And yeah, I just kind of lost interest.
I probably should be very much in the throes of it. So I'm very aware of what you're describing.
Yeah. As a fellow podcast host, like, what are some tips and tricks that you would give other people doing podcasts? I tell everybody to do a podcast. I think it's the coolest thing. I'm like, what are you super passionate about? What could you talk to somebody about for like the entire evening? Go do a podcast on that.
Yeah, I think it's like find something that my rule is like if you can do more than 5 episodes, you can do 100, you can do 200, you can do 300. But you got to find something that after 5 episodes you haven't said everything there is to say, right? And so that for me is people analytics, workforce planning, talent intelligence, and the title directionally correct is apt because it's somewhat of a humorous podcast. It's not just like here's how to do people analytics and we're going to go through the steps. It's a lot about like two guys that have PhDs and what it would be like at happy hour if they were talking about the problems they were having at work. It's more like those along those lines. So it's a lot more fun. But in terms of having a podcast, I will say when you get really into it, so when you start, you hate the sound of your own voice. I find that every human being hates. Well, I've gotten to this point now because I think I'm a little closer to it. I don't outsource as much of this stuff as you do. Is I've heard my voice talk so many times, I actually see myself as another person. I don't see myself as me. I've like disassociated in that way. And because of that, I've learned so much more about myself, especially my flaws, the uncomfortable things that I don't like about myself, that it's a really great self-discovery mechanism. And I never
Totally.
would have thought that that would have been the case, but I've learned so much about myself because of this podcast.
Do you go back and actually listen to all your episodes?
No, because I have to listen to the episodes so many times when they're coming out. I say, and I wonder if you have this experience. I've never heard anybody else describe this. It feels like time travel. And the reason why is because when an episode comes out, I recorded that episode like 4 weeks in the past.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the conversation I'm having right now with somebody is going to come out 4 weeks in the future. But also, I'm talking to people today about episodes that I'm going to record 4 weeks in the future. And so I feel like at any given time, I'm time traveling and hearing things about the past and in the future. And it's very disorienting sometimes because I'm like, people will ask me a question because they're talking about things that I was talking about a month ago
4 weeks ago. Yeah.
and I forgot about it. And I don't even remember what we were talking about at that point.
I'll forget. I've had your episode one almost 150 now. And I'll forget the people that have been on my podcast at this point,
Yeah.
because they were on the podcast a year and a half ago.
I mean,
I'm like, oh yeah, you were
I'll
episode
see somebody at an
14.
event and I'll say, "Hey, you want to come on my podcast sometime?" And they'll say, "Oh, I've already been on there." I'm like,
So I started like actually searching my tracker, my Google sheet for the name just to make sure, just in case, right? Like, oh crap, did I invite? Have they actually been on the podcast?
Yeah. You get to a certain point, you have enough number of guests and you start to forget.
I don't think I'll ever stop doing it. I freaking love it. And that's why we call it the Ignite podcast, not the Team Ignite Ventures podcast, because I wanted to be able to talk to people about anything. And so far it's mostly been startups, venture capital, LPs. I've had a meditation teacher on here about transcendental meditation. I don't know what I'll call this episode. Maybe it'll be called Ignite People. And so I wanted to keep it flexible so I can talk about anything. And then that way listeners know what the topic's going to be. And so they can just skip it if they're just not interested. Oh, I don't want to hear from an LP. I don't want to hear from a family office. I don't care. But my VC pals would love to hear from family offices and what they're
Yeah.
thinking about, right?
Yep, they would. Well, and the thing about it is it really does quench your curiosities and it gives you a reason to talk to people because otherwise, like you could always buy someone lunch and, ask for their mentorship or something like that. But if you offer to be a megaphone for their own story, their own wisdom, you get to learn as a consequence, but also to everyone else. And so it's kind of a mutually beneficial thing that you're doing. I think it's a great thing.
It's so great. Yeah. And then you could get people, you could talk to people that you wouldn't normally talk to,
Hmm.
meta people analytics heads, and folks like that. So I've had, lots of VCs and lots of really cool founders. Most of the founders have been part of the portfolio for obvious reasons. I'm trying to help them get free PR, but I've had other founders on that are just really cool. We're going to do a new one called Ignite Exits. So we're going to have founders. A lot of my founders are at the beginning, right? They're
Yeah.
seed and series A, kind of in that range. I've had some series B, but I want to also have like, hey, like post exit, you're 5, 10, 15 years down the journey. Now let's talk about that reflection.
Well, how many of them would there be? Is that going to be a short list of folks, or do you have a
Well,
lot of them?
there's about 10,000 companies worldwide that get pre-series A funding every year. About 200 of them turn into eventual billion-dollar companies over time. So there's hundreds per year
Yeah.
of folks to talk to that have been successful with their startups.
The question I would always ask myself in that situation is the person who you talk to in the Series A the same person who exits the company? Because a lot of times
Not
they
always.
might actually be different people.
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes the founder, they exit after acquisition, obviously, or even an IPO. Or sometimes it's pre-IPO. Sometimes a late stage investor comes in and says, hey, you're just not the right person to take this thing public.
Well,
But that
yeah,
would still
I
be a
actually
good
meant it
opportunity.
dual-fold too, like, not just the same like, it's literally a different human being, but I also mean, like, the evolution that a single human being makes from being, Mark Zuckerberg and the social network to Mark Zuckerberg, who's, like, whatever Mark Zuckerberg's doing now.
Apologetic in front of Congress to
Yeah.
Mark Zuckerberg with a gold chain and just living his best life.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, people go through these like 5 to 10 year phases of their lives,
Yeah.
and it'll be really fascinating, 15 years from now to have folks like you back on and some of my founders that I interviewed right when they're starting, like just basically just around product market fit is when we invest, right? And just to have them come back and reflect 5 or 10 years later, those would be really good episodes.
I probably would, yeah. That would be amazing.
Yeah. Any other tips or advice from a fellow podcaster or anything you've learned, tips of the trade?
I mean, the thing I always tell people is just keep going, right? Like that's the main thing you can do. You'll figure it out as long as you keep going and you're willing to experiment with new things over time. Like we talked about this before last time we spoke, but like I consciously don't use clips and things like that for the podcast because I want to know, is my growth organic or is it algorithmic based? And I know if I go through and do clips and if something blows up, I know it's because the algorithm, not because of us, right? And so I would rather our growth be more word of mouth. And I know that's like really that's probably the most old school thing I'll say today, but I want to know that people like us for us. And that's probably the most genuine thing I believe.
You're making a really good point here, which is, and I think we talked about it, which is the clips just outperform the long form
Correct.
content by leaps and bounds. I mean, I'm lucky to get 1,000 or 2,000 views per episode across all the channels for the long form content, which is not bad. I mean, when I started, it was like
Yeah.
10 views, right? And the clips will get, my best clip has hundreds of thousands of views
Yeah.
across all the channels, right? So, I mean, just the enormity of the reach, which is really a testament to, I think, people's preferences. We live in a kind of a TikTok real kind of scrolling kind of culture,
Yep.
and people just don't spend the time to go listen to a long form podcast or listen to a book even. I've actually pulled back from listening to podcasts, which sounds funny as a podcast host, but I'm very careful. There's just two or three that I really listen to, and then I just try to get back into books and just go really
I
deep on
yeah.
topics.
When I started, because I haven't really pulled back as much as I've changed what I listen to, is I figured out that if I listen to anything HR, technology, people analytics, workforce planning related on a podcast, I'll just become a parrot of what they say on mine. So I had
Yeah.
to cut those out completely. I listen to no other
That's
podcast.
exactly where I'm getting to right now. I do
Yeah.
not listen to any other VC. Like I listen to All In podcasts, but they really talk about politics and the economy more than
Yeah.
startups and venture capital now. And then I was listening to all the other VC and startup podcasts, and I realized like I live and breathe this, 60, 70 hours a week. I do not need to listen to anybody else's opinions on this anymore. It like, I've 5 years and 7 years into the startup investing journey. Now I'm kind of going back to my roots of like just listening to books.
Yeah.
But
Books are so underrated. Like it's hard to actually sit down and read a book nowadays. I feel like my phone has trained me to not want to read a book, but I've literally got 6 books sitting on my desk in front of me and a whole library behind me, obviously, and I'm working my way through all of them. And I find
you read
myself to be
on.
so mentally energized after reading a book.
Yeah, it's just way more fulfilling, I think. That being said, if you're trying to get into a topic like people analytics, a good way to get started is listening to podcasts. When I was getting into venture capital and startup investing, that's all I listened to for 4 or 5 years.
I mean, I'm not saying don't listen to Directionally Correct because you absolutely should, but
And with technology, if you're trying to learn AI, you should definitely not pick up a book. You should
no,
listen to
no,
podcasts
not at
and
all.
watch YouTube videos on AI because that's where the tip of the spear stuff. Listen to paper breakdowns, and that's the nerdy stuff I dive really deep on YouTube. If you saw my YouTube feed, you'd be like, you're a big nerd, Brian. It's like basketball, it's games, and it's like AI.
Yeah.
And it's just really deep in AI, like paper breakdown level down into like the mathematical symbology of an AI model. Like I get pretty nerdy.
That's fascinating. The thing, and I definitely don't read books on that for that reason. I read books to understand humanity, right? Because if you really want to understand, like I wrote this in one of the articles that I've put that kind of showed up in my book as well. It's like if you want to understand technology, you've got to do it and you've got to learn and stay on the bleeding edge. But if you want to understand humanity, read history, read biographies,
Bingo.
read the
Yeah.
ancients, right? And so I've been trying to kind of balance both of those, and I find it personally very helpful.
Yeah, I love that. So you've advised lots of HR tech startups. What's the biggest piece of advice you'd give a founder building an HR focused SaaS company today?
So the ones that I've talked that I've advised, so I advised 2 stealth ones right now, and I've had 3 that I've done in the past. Most of the ones that I've done in the past have been pre-product market fit. And so I was just trying to help them get to product market fit. The ones I'm talking to now I've been a little bit more choosy as time has gone along. And one is doing, so I feel like that I've never had an original thought, but the closest thing I've had to an original thought is these 2 things that I've written about. One is called the Inquisitor and the Change Agent, and the other one is a theory I call everyone gets paid the same, and each one of the startups is tackling one of those big ideas. And so I was like, okay, who's going to bring about these ideas into the real world? And these organizations have a chance of manifesting that and kind of seeing in the marketplace of ideas, is this going to have viability? And so I'm playing more in the idea space right now with the ones that I'm advising.
I love that. Why don't we wrap up with a rapid fire?
Yeah, let's do it.
What's the most impactful people analytics stat that companies aren't paying enough attention to?
I've been asked this by like so many HR tech publications, and like you'd have to know more about the field of biopsychology, but the field of biopsychology, the biggest joke that everyone tells at every cocktail party is it depends, and it's like ha ha ha, ha, everybody laughs,
Right.
and I'm
That was a joke in business school. It depends.
yeah, and I'm
Yeah.
still over that joke. The problem is there is no like smoking gun HR like people analytics metric. Like there are things that every organization should be tracking just because they're like hygienic to know those things. But in terms of adding value, it would be whatever HR metric is correlated the most with how your business makes money. And I don't know what that metric is, but your organization better know what that metric is.
I love that. If you could give one piece of advice to a first time CHRO, what would it be?
Figure out how to be an organizational therapist. because I was on that track at one point to become a CHRO, and I got off that track really quickly when I figured out what the job was, and I did not was not interested in it at all. And a lot of it had to do with how to be an arbiter, how to be, the person at the C-suite who hears everybody's problems but solves them behind the scenes and never gets any of the glory. So yeah, I never not super interested in doing that.
Which HR tech company do you think is making the biggest moves right now?
Thinking the biggest moves. I'll give it kind of a off-brand answer, but this is a company I'm not advising, but I just am fascinated by. It's a little startup called Arbor, and they are trying to go from a first principle standpoint and build people analytics AI first. And I've seen some of the stuff that they're doing. I think that they've got a lot of work ahead of them, but they're taking a fascinating look at it, and I'm very excited to see where they go.
Gen AI and HR, game changer or overblown hype?
2024, 2025, overblown hype. 2027, probably game changer.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think, I wonder if we're going to enter a valley of disillusionment with AI pretty soon, where they're going to be like, gosh, we thought it was going to change everything. It's not going to change anything. And then 5 years from now, it did change everything.
Yeah, we're actually doing some research on this internally, and we were talking about it earlier today. And we think that the catalyst for the hitting the valley of disillusionment is when the bill comes home. So when AI companies start passing through the real costs to customers, and
Mm.
customers are unwilling to pay that cost, that's when it's going to happen.
Yeah, I see this a lot in demos. I'm just like, it looks cool. It's just so early, and the tech's going to take a year or two to kind of iron out, maybe longer. What's a HR metric that you think should be retired?
Hmm. Well, I don't know if it should be, but it probably will be. A lot of the DEI stuff is getting retired right now, whether people want it to or not. And I think People Analytics has done a ton of really great work in that space over the years. And I think a lot of it is going to get retired just for political reasons.
Yeah, we seem to be overreacting a little bit. And this is how our society, for better or worse in America, kind of goes, right? We just kind of go way far to the right, and then we go way far to the left. And then, my partner led DEI at LinkedIn,
Mhm.
or from a she was on the product marketing team that led DEI. And we'd always get into these debates on equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome.
Yeah.
You
Well, I
know,
think that's where if it wouldn't be such a pendulum if we could agree on what its purpose was, then it wouldn't be such a pendulum swing. But because we can't agree, is everybody's overcorrecting all the
so
time.
I think what happened was is everybody went too far into the equality of outcome category.
That's what I mean.
Which is not the right way to think about it. It's like,
Correct.
are we giving everybody the right opportunities?
Correct. Yeah.
Are we biased in our hiring practices? Like, we should know, right?
Well, it's like I can't remember where I heard this expression, but if you go on one bad date, probably the other person's a jerk. But if you go on 100 bad dates, you're the jerk, right? And so if you have one bad interview, they may be biased. But if you have 100 bad interviews, you need to up your game.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I love that. If you had to bet on one major shift in workforce planning by the year 2030, what would it be?
Well, this is a fascinating one from our work. We've published a lot of research on the demographic drought and the rising storm, and so we know for certainty it's not really a prediction. Is that people are having less babies, less people are turning the age of 18. There will be less people in the workforce, and baby boomers are retiring. And that means that the skill mix of the workforce between now and 2030 is going to change dramatically. There's going to be a huge shortage of people in the service industries and more blue collar jobs. And there's going to be an excess of people in the white collar industries and knowledge workers. And that's going to create huge supply and demand swings that we have never experienced before between now and 2030. I don't
How do you
think
think
people are
like
ready.
AI and robotics might impact that in the next 5 years? Because figure robotics is starting to beta test home-based robotics later this year, which is crazy.
Yeah. Well, it's already,
And
it's
we
already
have a
prevalent
portfolio
in demand.
Yeah. So like I can imagine walking into a restaurant in the next 5 years max, and it's mostly just robots.
Well, we created a workforce risk index where we scored every Fortune 1000 company on four variables. One was their industry, one was the markets in which they operate. So, what physical locations are they? What are the top 10 occupations that they have? We also put an AI risk in there, and essentially it was like AI gives you optionality. So whether it be via robots or whether it's helping, at a drive-through to have an AI take your order rather than a human being take your order. And the industries that scored the worst were ones where there really hasn't been AI capabilities for helping. So, like nurses, I don't think we're at a point as society where we're ready to have robot nurses yet.
Yeah.
and I don't think we'll be
Assistants.
there by
Robot
2030.
assistants that come
Yeah,
change bedpans and,
sure.
make sure
Sure.
your IV's in the right vein or whatever. But,
Yeah,
you
you would
you
hope.
kinda you need that human touch.
Yeah, and I think some of that stuff is gonna come. I'm just not sure it's gonna be here by 2030.
Yeah. What's your favorite Substack newsletter besides your own?
Yeah, it's a buddy of mine, Toby Colshaw. He leads the Talent Intelligence Collective. It's a podcast and a Substack newsletter. He puts some very thoughtful stuff out there and sometimes controversial, and he'll always put the controversial ones behind a paywall. And I'm like, good job.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
What about podcasts, besides your own?
It is the Talent Intelligence Collective is also a good
It's
podcast.
a
I
Substack and a
listen to
podcast.
it. It's adjacent enough that I can listen without it like corrupting my thoughts. But in terms of like other podcasts that I like, I'll tell you like this is going to tell you a lot about me on a personal level. I've been going deep into UFOs and all that stuff lately. And so there's this guy Jesse Michaels who's been doing a bunch of stuff in that space, and so I've been listening to his stuff a lot lately.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me, I'm a big sci-fi nerd myself. We're rewatching Battlestar Galactica right now. We'll watch all the Star Treks. Just finished The Expanse. That was really good. It seems pretty unlikely that there's not life elsewhere.
Yeah,
The only question is like, do they have the technology to get here faster than light? And if so, they probably are here.
yeah. Or
They're probably
maybe
here watching us, and they're just waiting for the prime directive, warp drive moment to get in touch.
Or maybe they're us from the future, or maybe they've always been here and we didn't know about it. Yeah, there's a lot of different variants on this question.
Yeah. No, and we'll probably live to see it. I think what they're waiting for is kind of post AGI or ASI.
Yeah.
I think that's the warp drive moment when you can actually build your own intelligence and have an intelligence explosion. I think it changes society. It's the singularity, right?
Yeah.
And we're ready now to talk to you because you have artificial superintelligence. Because by 2045, we'll have the equivalent of trillions and trillions and trillions of human minds all working on scientific discoveries and technological discoveries. And really, we're going to probably cross AGI now or soonish, and then ASI is right behind that.
Yeah. Talk.
I think the aliens are waiting for that. I think by 2050 we'll be in touch with the aliens. That'd be my prediction.
Yeah. Well, bring me back on then and we'll figure it out.
Wow, that's a heady topic. Back to people analytics. What's the biggest misconception of people analytics?
I don't even know if it's a misconception, but because I think it's actually true in a lot of cases, but that people analytics just counts things. And that is true. I wish it wasn't true because a lot of it should be about the data science and AI components about how you're making better predictions, how you're bringing more insights. But a lot of times it's just counting things.
I love that. Reductionist. You've taught at multiple universities. What's one HR analytics concept that students struggle with the most?
So I've always taught in business schools, and in the business schools, the funny thing, I've had multiple students tell me this over the years, is that they just always saw that HR was irrelevant. And they learned through this course that HR actually could be relevant to business strategy. And I take a lot of pride when they leave the course and they say something along those lines.
Last question. What's a book that every founder should read to understand the space better?
There's a book called Investing in People, and it's literally about the calculations for how you show the human capital ROI of your workers. And it goes through it in methodologically and shows you how by Wayne Cascio, John Boudreau, and Alexis Fink, the lady I mentioned earlier. And it's fantastic.
Well, it's been a great conversation. How can folks find you online?
Mostly on LinkedIn, listen to Directionally Correct, follow the research that I'm doing at Lightcast. And yeah, I'm not much of a social media guy otherwise.
Yeah, some of us aren't.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Brian.